Montana Territory, 1873. The twilight winds swept across the golden prairie like the breath of a vengeful ghost, but Colton James didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in what he could see, what he could touch, and the cold, hard facts of survival in a land that took more often than it gave. At 25, he'd already learned that lesson well enough. The frontier was no place for softness, for dreams, or God help him, for love. Those were luxuries for folks back east who'd never had to bury their own. He adjusted his Stetson against the setting sun and guided his Palomino along the ridge overlooking his modest spread. 3 years of backbreaking work had yielded a small cabin, a decent herd, and the solitude he'd convinced himself was all he needed. The ranch wasn't much, but it was his, paid for with sweat and the blood of the war that had stolen his youth and left him with nightmares that still woke him in the cold hours before dawn. "Home, sweet home," he murmured to the horse, though the words rang hollow. The cabin waited below, dark and empty, just as he'd left it 3 weeks ago when he'd ridden out to deliver cattle to the railroad in Helena. Just as it always was, just as it should be. A man alone couldn't be disappointed, couldn't be abandoned, couldn't be hurt. His gaze drifted to the distant mountains, already tipped with early snow though September had barely begun. Winter would come early this year. Another season of isolation stretched before him, and for the first time, the thought didn't bring its usual comfort. The last light caught something unusual, movement near his cabin. Colton stiffened, hand instinctively dropping to the Colt at his hip. Raiders weren't uncommon, and a man living alone made an easy target. He nudged his mount forward, keeping to the treeline as he approached, eyes narrowed against the gathering dusk. What he saw stopped him cold. A woman stood at his well, struggling with the pump handle. Even from this distance, he could see she was young, dressed in a travel-worn blue calico dress that had once been fine but now showed the marks of a hard journey. Her honey-blonde hair had partially escaped its pins, cascading down her back in waves that caught the dying light. But it was the bundle in her arms that truly froze him in place. A small bundle wrapped in a pale blanket that she clutched protectively to her chest as she attempted to draw water one-handed. Strangers didn't just appear at isolated homesteads in Montana Territory, especially not young women with babes in arms. Colton's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. She could be bait for an ambush, though he couldn't spot any waiting attackers. She could be running from the law, though her demeanor spoke more of desperation than cunning. He approached slowly, making enough noise that she'd hear him coming. The woman startled anyway, whirling around with eyes wide with fear, eyes the color of summer cornflowers, he noticed despite himself. She clutched the bundle tighter against her chest. "This is private property, ma'am," he said, keeping his voice neutral as he dismounted but maintained a cautious distance. "I know," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm looking for Colton James." The sound of his name on a stranger's lips sent a chill down his spine. "You found him, though I don't believe we've been introduced." "Hannah Neal," she said, a strange expression crossing her face, something between relief and apprehension. "I've come a long way to find you, Mr. James." "Most folks don't come looking for me unless there's trouble," he observed, keeping his hand near his gun. "What business brings you all this way?" She hesitated, glancing down at the bundle in her arms, then back at him with a gaze that seemed to be measuring his character. Whatever she saw must have decided something for her. "This is Emma," she said softly, adjusting the blanket to reveal a small, perfect face framed by wisps of dark hair. "The baby couldn't have been more than 3 months old. She's your daughter." The world seemed to tilt beneath Colton's boots. "That's not possible." "Last December, Billings, the snow was so bad the stage couldn't leave for 3 days. Her words hung in the chilling air between them. The memory hit him like a physical blow. The snowstorm, the small hotel. The lovely young woman traveling to visit her aunt, stranded like him by the blinding blizzard. 3 days that had felt like stepping into someone else's life, 3 days of conversation by the fire, shared meals, and eventually shared warmth in the night. 3 days before returning to the real world where men like him had no business dreaming of anything more. "I never knew your last name," he said hoarsely, "nor I yours until later." She shifted the baby, who made a small sound of discontent. "I'm not here to trap you, Mr. James, I only," her voice broke slightly. "I needed you to know she exists. I've written it all down, what I'm asking, what I hope for her." You'll understand when you read it." Before he could respond, the baby began to cry in earnest, and Hannah turned her attention to soothing the child with practiced movements that spoke of countless sleepless nights. Something twisted in Colton's chest at the sight. "You'd better come inside," he said finally. "Night's falling and it gets cold quick up here." The cabin was just as he'd left it, sparse but tidy, with a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall. He busied himself lighting the fire, grateful for the task that allowed him to gather his thoughts while Hannah settled herself in his single chair, murmuring softly to the baby. "Are you hungry?" he asked stiffly when he could delay no longer. "I can heat some beans, maybe make coffee." "That would be kind, thank you." The domestic scene that followed was surreal, this stranger with her child in his home, the three of them existing in an uneasy silence broken only by the crackling fire and the occasional soft sounds from the baby. When Emma finally drifted to sleep, Hannah carefully laid her on the bed, constructing a barrier of blankets to keep the infant from rolling. "She looks like you," Hannah said quietly. "Around the eyes." Colton couldn't bring himself to look too closely. A daughter, the word alone was enough to send panic through him. What did he know of being a father? His own had died when he was 12, leaving him to look after his mother until the consumption took her too. Then the war, and after that, the emptiness of drifting until he'd found this patch of Montana to call his own. "What exactly are you expecting from me, Miss Neal?" he asked, more harshly than he'd intended. She flinched slightly but met his gaze steadily. "Only what you're willing to give." She reached into a small bag and withdrew a folded paper. "I've written it all down, please read it, think about it." "That's all I ask tonight." She handed him the folded paper, and he noted how her fingers trembled slightly. His own weren't much steadier as he accepted it, unable to bring himself to read it in her presence. "You're welcome to the bed," he said instead. "I'll take the floor by the fire." Her relief was palpable. "Thank you, we've been traveling for so long, She shook her head. "Thank you." Later, with Hannah and the baby asleep in his bed, Colton sat before the dying fire and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was neat, educated. He remembered her mentioning she'd been a schoolteacher before traveling to visit her aunt in Montana. "Colton," it began without preamble. "By the time you read this, you'll have met our daughter. I've named her Emma Grace after my mother. She was born on July 12th of this year, healthy and strong despite my fears. She has your eyes and, I suspect, your stubborn nature already. I'm not writing to demand marriage or support, though I won't pretend we don't need help. My aunt died this past spring, leaving me her small savings but no home. My position as a teacher was filled when I began to show, and no respectable school will hire an unwed mother. What I'm asking is consideration. If you want no part in Emma's life, I will understand, and we will trouble you no further. If you wish to know her, even from a distance, I would welcome that for her sake. And if perhaps there might be a place for us here, even temporarily while I find my feet again, that would be a kindness I would work to repay. I remember those days in Billings. I remember your kindness, your stories of this place you were building. I remember thinking you were a good man, Colton James, beneath the scars the war left on you. I hope I wasn't wrong. Whatever you decide, Emma deserves to know her father's name. That much at least I can give her. With hope, Hannah Neal. The letter was signed with his own name, written in her hand. Colton James, not as a signature, he realized, but as a statement, a fact for his daughter to know someday. He stared into the embers, the paper heavy in his hands. A daughter, a responsibility he'd never asked for, never prepared for. His hard-won freedom suddenly complicated by a woman and child who had every right to claim a piece of him, yet who seemed to be asking for so little. Sleep eluded him that night, and dawn found him still seated by the cold fireplace, the letter folded neatly in his pocket. Hannah awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, she forgot where she was. Then she saw Emma sleeping peacefully beside her, and the events of yesterday came rushing back. She'd found him. After months of searching, after all the dead ends and disappointments, she'd found Colton James. She'd known it would be difficult. Known he might reject them entirely. What she hadn't expected was how seeing him again would affect her. He was just as she remembered, tall and lean, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt and eyes the color of a storm-darkened sky. The same eyes now mirrored in their daughter's face. Hannah quickly tidied herself as best she could, painfully aware of how travel-worn she must appear. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen, Colton was standing at his small stove, his back to her. "Good morning," she ventured. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Morning, thought you might be hungry." "Thank you," she glanced toward the bed. "Emma will be waking soon. She usually feeds right after dawn." He nodded stiffly, and Hannah felt the weight of awkwardness between them. This man who had once shared such intimacy with her was now a stranger again, separated by months of life lived apart and the enormous reality of the child they'd created. "I read your letter," he said abruptly, setting a plate before her. "You can stay until you figure out your next steps. Winter's coming and the passes will be closing soon anyway. It wouldn't be safe for you to travel with a baby." Relief flooded through her, though it was tempered by the clear implication that their stay would be temporary. "That's very generous. I can help around the place, earn our keep." "It's not much of a place for a woman and child," he said, glancing around the sparse cabin, "but it's shelter." Before she could respond, Emma began to stir, her small face scrunching as she worked up to a cry. Hannah moved quickly to lift her, cradling her close and murmuring soothing words. "She'll need changing," Hannah explained, reaching for her bag, "and then she'll be hungry." Colton looked distinctly uncomfortable. "I'll step outside while you attend to her." "Mr. James," Hannah called as he reached for the door. "Colton, would you like to hold her once she's settled?" He froze, one hand on the latch, tension visible in the set of his shoulders. For a long moment, Hannah thought he would refuse outright. "Maybe later," he said finally, and was gone before she could respond. The next few days established an uneasy routine. Colton rose early and worked from dawn until dusk, managing his small herd, repairing fences, and chopping enough wood to see them through the coming winter. Hannah took over the domestic affairs of the cabin, cooking, cleaning, and caring for Emma while trying to make herself as unobtrusive as possible. They spoke little beyond the necessities, tiptoeing around the enormous reality of their situation. Colton kept a careful distance from both Hannah and the baby, watching them from the corner of his eye when he thought she wouldn't notice. On the fourth day, as an early autumn storm rattled the windows, Hannah's patience finally wore thin. "She won't break, you know," she said as Colton ducked out of the way when she approached with Emma in her arms, "and neither will you from holding her once." He stilled, caught in the act of retreat. "I don't know anything about babies." "Nobody does until they learn," Hannah countered, holding her ground. "She's your daughter, Colton. The least you could do is meet her properly." Something flashed in his eyes, fear, she realized with sudden clarity. This man who had survived war and the brutal frontier was terrified of a 10-pound infant. "Here," she said, softening her approach, "just sit down first." To her surprise, he complied, lowering himself stiffly into the chair by the fire. Hannah approached carefully and demonstrated how to position his arms. "Support her head like this," she instructed, and then, before he could protest further, she placed Emma in his arms. Colton went completely still, as though the slightest movement might shatter the child. Emma, for her part, merely blinked up at this new face, her tiny brow furrowing in concentration. "She's so small," he whispered, a note of wonder breaking through his usual reserve. "She's grown since she was born," Hannah said, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "The midwife said she was a sturdy one, right from the start." As they watched, Emma's small hand escaped the blanket and waved in the air. Without thinking, Colton offered his finger and his daughter grasped it with surprising strength. "She has a good grip," he said, and Hannah didn't miss the slight tremor in his voice. "Yes," she agreed softly, "she holds on to what matters." The storm raged outside, but in the cabin, something shifted, a small, barely perceptible thaw in the ice Colton had built around himself. As September gave way to October, the mountain peaks disappeared beneath early snow and the routine of the small cabin evolved. Hannah took over more of the indoor chores, preparing for winter with a competence that surprised Colton. She mended clothing, preserved the last of the garden vegetables, and transformed the sparse cabin into something approaching a home. Colton, meanwhile, found himself drawn more and more to the small wonder that was his daughter. Though he still maintained a careful distance from Hannah herself, He began to spend his evenings watching Emma, marveling at her growing awareness, the way she tracked movement with her eyes, the strength in her tiny limbs as she kicked and squirmed. "She rolled over today," Hannah announced one evening as Colton returned from checking the livestock, all by herself. The pride in her voice was matched by the unexpected surge of it in his own chest. "Already, isn't that early?" Hannah nodded, her face lighting up. "She's strong like her father." The words hung between them, a reminder of connections neither could deny. Colton cleared his throat, uncomfortable with both the compliment and the implication. "Winter's coming on hard," he said instead. "Thompson at the general store says it'll be a bad one. I need to ride into town tomorrow, get some supplies while the pass is still clear." "Of course," Hannah's smile dimmed slightly. "We'll manage here." "It's only for the day," he found himself adding, surprisingly reluctant to disappoint her. "I'll be back by nightfall." The town of Pine Creek was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel when necessary, a small church, and a scattering of homes and businesses strung along the main street. Colton made his purchases efficiently, adding items he'd never bought before: yards of soft flannel for baby clothes, a tin of talcum powder, extra soap. "Heard you got company up at your place," Thompson commented as he tallied the purchases. "Young woman and a baby, they're saying." Colton stiffened. News traveled fast in isolated communities, and he'd been naive to think Hannah's arrival would go unnoticed. "That's right." "Related to you?" The shopkeeper's question was casual, but Colton recognized the fishing for gossip. "Yes," he said shortly, offering nothing more. Thompson seemed about to press further when the door opened, admitting a blast of cold air and three men Colton recognized as hands from the Blackwell Ranch to the north. The largest of them, a brute named Tucker, spotted Colton and nudged his companions. "Well, if it ain't the hermit come down from his mountain," Tucker drawled. "Heard you got yourself some female company finally. Must be desperate to come all the way out here for the likes of you." Colton ignored him, continuing to count out payment for his purchases. He'd learned long ago that men like Tucker fed on reaction. "Word is she's got a brat with her," another of the men added. "Yours, is it, or you just taking in strays now?" Colton's hand stilled momentarily on the coins, the only outward sign that the words had struck home. "My business is my own," he said evenly, completing his transaction and gathering his supplies. "Awful young thing from what I heard," Tucker continued, deliberately blocking Colton's path to the door. "Pretty too, maybe when you're done with her." He never finished the sentence. Colton's fist connected with his jaw with enough force to send the larger man stumbling backward into a display of canned goods. The other two cowboys started forward, but Thompson's shotgun appeared over the counter with a distinctive click. "Not in my store, boys," the shopkeeper warned. "Take it outside or not at all." Tucker spat blood onto the floorboards, his eyes narrowed with malice. "This ain't over, James." "Yes it is," Colton replied, his voice deadly quiet. "The lady is my wife, the child is my daughter. Anyone who suggests otherwise answers to me, understood?" The lie came easily, necessary protection in a place where an unmarried woman with a child would be subject to endless speculation and unwanted attention. Tucker glared but backed down, recognizing something in Colton's eyes that warned against pushing further. Colton gathered his purchases and left, the encounter leaving him unsettled in ways he didn't want to examine too closely. The claim had been a practical one, a shield for Hannah's reputation in a community that would judge her harshly otherwise. It meant nothing beyond that, he told himself. So why did the word wife linger on his tongue, feeling simultaneously foreign and strangely right? Hannah was at the window when he returned, Emma asleep in a makeshift cradle nearby. The relief on her face at his appearance sent an unexpected warmth through him. "I was beginning to worry," she admitted. "The clouds are coming in fast." "Got caught up in town," he replied, unloading the supplies and deliberately not mentioning the confrontation. "Got everything we needed, though." Her eyes widened as he unpacked the baby items. "You thought to get these." Thompson's wife helped, he admitted. "Said every baby needs proper things, especially with winter coming." Hannah ran her fingers over the soft flannel. "This is very kind, I can start sewing tomorrow." There's something else we need to discuss, Colton said, setting aside the last of the supplies. People in town are talking about you and Emma being here. Her face fell, color draining from her cheeks. I see, if you'd prefer we find somewhere else. That's not what I meant, he interrupted. It's not safe for a woman alone out here, especially with a child. People make assumptions and not all of them are decent about it. What are you saying? Hannah asked cautiously. Colton ran a hand through his hair, uncomfortable but determined. I told them you're my wife, that Emma is my daughter. It's simpler that way, safer for both of you. Oh, her eyes widened slightly. I see. It's just for appearances, he added quickly, just until you decide what comes next for you and Emma. Hannah nodded slowly. Of course, that's very practical of you. If anyone comes by, we should stick to that story, he continued, busying himself with arranging the supplies rather than meeting her gaze. We met in Billings last winter, married quickly, and you've only just been able to join me. I understand, her voice was steady, but something in it made him finally look up. Her expression was composed, revealing nothing of her thoughts. Thank you for thinking of our safety. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only when Emma stirred and began to fuss. Hannah moved to attend to her and Colton retreated to his usual evening tasks, the conversation weighing heavily in the air. That night, as had become their routine, Hannah and Emma took the bed while Colton made his pallet by the fire. As he stared at the ceiling, sleep eluding him, he found himself contemplating the strange twist his solitary life had taken. For years, he'd convinced himself that isolation was preference, that the absence of connection was freedom rather than emptiness. Now his cabin contained the soft sounds of his daughter's breathing and the gentle presence of a woman who asked so little yet deserved far more than he'd offered. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly consider what it might mean if they stayed, not temporarily but permanently. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it settled in his chest like a warm coal, glowing with unexpected possibility. The first heavy snow came a week later, blanketing the landscape in pristine white and effectively cutting them off from town until the spring thaw. Hannah watched through the window as Colton trudged through knee-deep drifts to check on the livestock in the small barn, Emma balanced on her hip. That's your father, she whispered to the baby. He's making sure the animals are safe from the storm. Emma gurgled in response, her small hand reaching toward the glass as if trying to touch the distant figure. At 3 months, she was becoming more alert every day, her personality emerging in gummy smiles and determined wiggles. When Colton returned, stomping snow from his boots at the threshold, Hannah had hot coffee waiting. He accepted it with a nod of thanks, his cheeks ruddy from the cold. Everything secure? She asked. For now, he replied, warming his hands around the mug. Got the stock in the barn with enough feed to last until this passes. We're in for a few days of this, at least. The prospect of being truly snowbound together brought a new tension to their carefully maintained routine. The cabin, which had seemed adequate before, now felt confining with 3 souls sheltering from the storm. That evening, as Hannah worked on sewing a new gown for Emma from the flannel Colton had purchased, she became aware of his eyes on her, watching her hands work the needle with practiced precision. My mother taught me, she explained without looking up. She said a woman should know how to create what her family needs. My mother was the same, Colton said, surprising her with the personal revelation. Could make something from nothing, it seemed like. After my father died, she kept us going on sheer determination. Hannah glanced up to find his expression distant, lost in memory. You must have loved her very much. She was everything, he said simply. When the consumption took her, there was nothing left to keep me in Kentucky. That's when I joined up with the Union Army. I was 17, told them I was 18. The war, Hannah said softly, you never spoke much about it in Billings. Not much worth speaking of. His tone made it clear the subject was closed, but a moment later, he continued unexpectedly. I was at Shiloh and Antietam, saw things no boy should see. Hannah set her sewing aside. I lost my brother at Gettysburg, he was 19. Colton met her gaze, a moment of understanding passing between them, the shared grief of a generation touched by unimaginable loss. I'm sorry. As am I for what you endured, She hesitated, then added gently, "Is that why you chose this life, the solitude?" He looked away, staring into the fire. After the war, being around people was difficult. Too much noise, too many expectations. Out here, things are simpler. A man faces what comes, answers to himself alone. Until now, Hannah observed quietly. Colton's eyes shifted to Emma, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Until now, he agreed, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. The storm lasted 3 days, confining them to the cabin's close quarters and forcing a new intimacy to their interactions. By necessity, they established a rhythm, Colton making brief excursions to care for the livestock, Hannah maintaining the domestic sphere, both of them learning to navigate around each other in the limited space. On the 4th day, the snow stopped and the sun emerged, transforming the landscape into a blinding expanse of white. Cabin fever drove Colton outside to clear paths to the barn and well, while Hannah bundled Emma warmly and followed, craving fresh air after days of confinement. "It's beautiful," she breathed, the mountain vista spread before them like a painting rendered in blue and white. "Dangerous beauty," Colton cautioned, glancing at the baby in her arms. "But yes, there's nothing else like it." Hannah watched him work, the easy strength in his movements as he shoveled snow. There was a grace to him, she thought, a kind of contained power that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin despite the burdens he carried. "How did you come to be here?" she asked. "Of all the places you could have settled after the war." Colton paused, leaning on his shovel. "Drifted west with the army for a while, scouting mostly. Saw this valley in '69, knew it was where I wanted to be. Took 2 years of saving and working to get enough for the claim, but I never forgot it." "You built all this yourself?" He shrugged, embarrassment coloring his features. "The cabin was here, abandoned, fixed it up, built the barn, bought my first few head of cattle, been adding a little each year." "It's impressive," Hannah said sincerely. "Not many men could do what you've done alone." Something flickered in his eyes, pleasure at the compliment, perhaps, or recognition of the truth in her words. Before he could respond, Emma began to fuss, the cold finally penetrating her blankets. "Better get her inside," Colton said. "I'll finish up here." Hannah nodded and turned toward the cabin, but her foot caught on a hidden patch of ice. She lurched forward, struggling to maintain her balance while protecting Emma in her arms. Before she could fall, strong arms caught her from behind, steadying her against a solid chest. "I've got you," Colton said, his voice close to her ear. For a moment, they remained frozen in that position, his arms around both her and the baby, her back pressed against his chest, their breath mingling in the cold air. Hannah felt the rapid beating of his heart, or perhaps it was her own, thundering in her ears. Slowly, he released her, ensuring she was steady on her feet before stepping back. "Careful on the ice," he said, his voice strangely rough, "paths treacherous until it's properly cleared." "Thank you," Hannah managed, suddenly breathless in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She hurried inside, Emma clutched close, aware of Colton's eyes following her every step. That night, something had changed in the atmosphere of the small cabin. Colton seemed unable to settle, moving restlessly between tasks, his gaze repeatedly drawn to Hannah and Emma as if seeing them anew. When Hannah prepared for bed, he cleared his throat awkwardly. "You should take my heavy coat tomorrow if you go outside," he said. "Yours is too thin for this weather." The concern warmed her more than any fire could. "Thank you. I will." As she lay in bed that night, listening to Colton's even breathing from his place by the fire, Hannah allowed herself to acknowledge the hope that had been growing within her since she'd first arrived. She hadn't come seeking marriage or even commitment, merely acknowledgement and perhaps some assistance for their daughter, but in the weeks since, something more had taken root. She'd begun to see the man beneath the gruff exterior, the one who chopped extra wood on cold nights, who watched his daughter with wonder in his eyes, who protected what was his with fierce determination. The same man she'd glimpsed during those snowbound days in Billings, thoughtful, gentle despite his strength, wounded but not broken by all he'd endured. Hannah closed her eyes, refusing to let herself dream too far ahead. For now they had shelter, safety, and a fragile peace. It would have to be enough. The days following the storm settled into a new pattern, one marked by small, significant shifts. Colton began spending more time inside the cabin, fashioning a proper cradle for Emma from wood he'd been saving for other projects. Hannah caught him more than once simply watching the baby, a look of wonder on his face when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as Hannah bathed Emma in a small tub by the fire, Colton abandoned any pretense of disinterest and knelt beside them, fascinated by the process. "She likes the water," he observed as Emma kicked her tiny legs, sending splashes onto both adults. Hannah laughed, wiping droplets from her face. "She's always loved her bath time. Even when she was newborn, it would calm her right down." Without being asked, Colton held out a towel and Hannah transferred the wet baby into his waiting hands. His movements were still cautious but increasingly confident as he wrapped Emma securely. "There you go, little one," he murmured, his voice softer than Hannah had ever heard it, "all warm and dry now." The tenderness in his expression made Hannah's heart constrict with a bittersweet ache. This was what she'd hoped for when she'd set out to find him, that he would know his daughter, that Emma would know her father's love. Yet it also highlighted the uncertain nature of their arrangement, the temporary status of their presence in his life. As if sensing her thoughts, Colton looked up, meeting her gaze over Emma's head. "She deserves better than this cabin," he said suddenly, "better than what I can give her." "She deserves to know her father," Hannah countered gently. "Which is more than many children have." He frowned, the familiar shadow of doubt crossing his features. "What kind of father can I be, Hannah? I've spent years avoiding responsibility for anyone but myself." It was the first time he'd used her given name since she'd arrived, and the sound of it on his lips sent a small thrill through her. "You're already being a father, Colton. Every time you hold her, protect her, wonder about her future, that's what fathers do." He looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep against his chest, one tiny hand curled against the rough fabric of his shirt. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, vulnerability naked in his voice, "how to be what she needs." "Nobody does at the start," Hannah said softly, echoing her words from weeks before. "We learn as we go. Together if you're willing." The word hung between them, together, with all its implications and possibilities. Colton's eyes darkened with something Hannah couldn't quite read, but before he could respond, a distant sound broke the moment, the jingle of harness and creak of wheels approaching the cabin. Colton was on his feet instantly, handing Emma back to Hannah and reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside," he ordered, all softness gone from his voice. "Don't come out unless I call for you." Fear gripped Hannah's heart as she clutched Emma close. Visitors in this weather at this hour could mean nothing good. She moved away from the windows, retreating to the far corner of the cabin as Colton stepped outside to confront whoever approached. Through the door left slightly ajar, she heard voices, Colton's, tense and wary, and another, unfamiliar male voice, louder and slurred with drink. The conversation grew heated, the stranger's tone becoming belligerent. "No, you got a woman up here," the voice challenged. "Tucker says she's a real pretty thing, too good for the likes of you." "My wife is none of your concern," Colton replied, his voice dangerously calm. "I suggest you turn around and head back to town before this gets unpleasant." "Wife?" The man laughed, an ugly sound. "That's not what I heard. Heard she showed up with a brat already in arms. Whose is it, James?" "You sure it's yours?" Hannah gasped, clutching Emma tighter. The baby, sensing her distress, began to whimper. "Last warning," Colton said, his voice carrying clearly through the cold air. "Get back on your horse and ride away, now." There was a shuffling sound, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Hannah's blood froze in her veins. "Think you're better than the rest of us," the stranger slurred. "Living up here alone, then suddenly got yourself a pretty woman. Maybe I'll just see for myself what's so special about her." What happened next was a blur of motion and sound. A shot rang out, followed by a cry of pain. Hannah bit back a scream, terrified for Colton, for Emma, for all of them. She heard the sound of a scuffle, then hoofbeats rapidly retreating into the distance. The door swung open and Colton appeared, his expression grim but apparently unharmed. "He's gone," he said tersely. "Shot wide, drunk fool, won't be back tonight, but he might bring others when he sobers up." "Who was that?" Hannah asked, her voice shaking. "One of Blackwell's men, same ones I had trouble with in town." Colton secured the door, checking the windows methodically. "They've been pushing boundaries since old man Blackwell died last spring. His son doesn't control them the way he did." Emma was crying in earnest now, disturbed by the commotion and Hannah's fear. Colton crossed to them, his expression softening as he looked at the distressed child. "She's all right," he said, gently touching the baby's head. "You both are, I won't let anything happen to you." Hannah believed him. Despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their situation, she knew with bone-deep certainty that Colton James would defend them with his life if necessary. "What will we do?" she asked, forcing steadiness into her voice for Emma's sake. Colton's jaw tightened. "First light, I'll ride to the Petersons' place. They're our nearest neighbors, about 5 miles east. Martha Peterson will stay with you while I go into town, have a word with young Blackwell about his men." "Is that safe?" Hannah couldn't keep the worry from her voice. "Safer than waiting for them to come back in force," he replied grimly. "This ends now before anyone else gets hurt." That night Colton abandoned his pallet by the fire, instead sitting upright in a chair positioned near the door, his rifle across his knees. Hannah lay awake long after Emma had settled, watching the profile of the man who had become their protector, illuminated by the dying firelight. "You should try to sleep," he said without turning, somehow aware of her vigilance. "So should you," she countered softly. He shook his head slightly. "I've gone longer without rest, had plenty of practice during the war." Hannah sat up, drawing the blanket around her shoulders against the night chill. "This is because of us, isn't it? You were left alone before we came." Colton turned then, his expression visible in the low light. "This was coming anyway," he said. "Blackwell's men have been looking for trouble since spring. You and Emma just gave them an excuse. Still, I'm sorry to have brought this to your door." "Don't be," his voice was firm. "Some things are worth fighting for." The words hung in the darkness between them, weighted with meaning that neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Hannah felt a flutter of hope beneath her ribs, quickly tempered by the reality of the danger they faced. "Try to sleep," Colton said again, more gently. "I'll keep watch." Trusting in his vigilance, Hannah eventually drifted into uneasy slumber, her dreams troubled by gunshots and nameless threats. True to his word, at first light Colton rode to the Petersons' farm and returned with Martha, a motherly woman in her 50s who took one look at Hannah and Emma and immediately adopted them both under her protective wing. "Don't you worry about a thing, dear," she assured Hannah as Colton prepared to leave. "My Josiah and the boys are keeping watch, and I've raised 6 children myself. That little angel and I will get along just fine." Colton checked his pistol and secured it at his hip, his expression grim and determined. Before mounting his horse, he paused beside Hannah, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If I'm not back by nightfall, Peterson will take you and Emma to their place. You'll be safe there until this is resolved." "Be careful," Hannah whispered, resisting the urge to reach for him. "Please." Something softened in his eyes. "I will. For both of you." The ride into Pine Creek gave Colton time to cool his anger to a manageable temperature. Raw fury would serve no one, least of all Hannah and Emma. What he needed now was calculated determination and the reputation he'd built as a man who meant what he said. The town was quiet as he rode in, just beginning to stir with morning activity. He tied his horse outside the Blackwell offices, a grand 2-story building that housed both the ranch business and the younger Blackwell's ambitions for political influence. Inside, a clerk looked up in surprise as Colton entered, tracking mud and purpose across the polished floor. "Mr. James, do you have an appointment?" "He'll see me," Colton stated flatly. "No." Before the clerk could object further, the inner office door opened, revealing Raymond Blackwell himself, a slim, collegiate man in his 30s who'd returned from Eastern schooling upon his father's death to take over the family empire. "Mr. James," Blackwell said smoothly, "I've been expecting you, please come in." The office was a study in Eastern opulence, with leather-bound books, a massive oak desk, and windows overlooking the town Blackwell's father had essentially built. Colton remained standing, declining the offered seat with a shake of his head. "One of your men rode to my property last night," he said without preamble, "armed and threatening my family. It stops now." Blackwell sighed, pouring himself a measure of whiskey despite the early hour. "Tucker mentioned an altercation. He says you've taken in a woman of questionable virtue with a child that may or may not be yours." "She's my wife," Colton said flatly. "The child is my daughter." But even if they weren't, they're under my protection, which should be enough for any decent man to respect. Of course, Blackwell raised a placating hand. No one questions your right to protect your own, James. But you must admit, the sudden appearance of a wife no one knew about raises questions. The only question, Colton replied, his voice dangerously soft, is whether you can control your men. Because if this happens again, I won't be coming to talk, understood? Blackwell studied him for a long moment, seeming to take the measure of the man before him. Whatever he saw must have convinced him, for he nodded slowly. I'll speak with Tucker and the others, make it clear that your property and family are to be respected. He paused, then added with calculated precision, though it might help matters if you were to make the marriage official in the eyes of the community. A proper ceremony, perhaps, to silence any lingering doubts. The suggestion landed like a physical blow, forcing Colton to confront the reality of their situation. The lie he'd told for Hannah's protection had become a tangled web, one that would eventually require either truth or commitment to resolve. That's between me and my wife, he said finally. Just keep your men in line, Blackwell. The younger man inclined his head in acknowledgement. Consider it done, though I would advise you to consider my suggestion for the lady's sake if nothing else. Colton left without further comment, the conversation weighing heavily on his mind as he made his way back through town. At the general store, he paused to purchase a few additional supplies, aware of the speculative glances and whispered conversations that followed him. Thompson approached as he was concluding his business, his expression troubled. Heard about the trouble last night, James, everyone's talking. Let them talk, Colton replied shortly. Thing is, Thompson continued, lowering his voice, it ain't just Blackwell's men. Preacher's wife is organizing the church ladies. They're saying it ain't right, a woman and baby living up there without proper vows being spoken. Colton stiffened. What'd I do on my own property? I know, Thompson raised a placating hand. Just thought you should be aware, this kind of talk can make things difficult, especially come spring when you'll need to do business in town. The implications were clear. Hannah's reputation and by extension Emma's would suffer unless the situation was formalized. The frontier had its own moral code, often stricter than back east in compensation for the lawlessness that otherwise prevailed. Colton completed his purchases in thoughtful silence and began the ride back to the cabin, his mind churning with possibilities and obligations. The snow-covered landscape offered no answers, only the stark reality of choices that could no longer be avoided. When he arrived home, he found Hannah and Martha Peterson in the midst of what appeared to be a cooking lesson, the cabin filled with the aroma of fresh bread. Emma lay contentedly in her new cradle, watching the activity with wide, curious eyes. Colton, Hannah's relief was palpable as she saw him enter unharmed. What happened? Is everything all right? Blackwell will keep his men in line, he replied, setting aside his rifle. We shouldn't have any more trouble from that quarter. Martha Peterson gave him a shrewd look. And the talk in town, did you address that as well? Colton hesitated, aware of Hannah's questioning gaze. That's a more complicated matter. Well, Martha said briskly, wiping her hands on her apron, I'd best be getting back before dark. Josiah will be wondering where his supper is. She gathered her things, then paused to pat Hannah's hand. You come visit when the weather allows, dear. It does a body good to have company sometimes, especially with little ones. After seeing Martha safely on her way with promises to check in on them regularly, Colton returned to find Hannah waiting expectantly, Emma now in her arms. What aren't you telling me? She asked directly. What's this talk in town Martha mentioned? Colton sighed, running a hand through his hair. People are talking about our situation, the suddenness of your arrival, the baby. Some are questioning the truth of our marriage. Understanding dawned in Hannah's eyes, and that puts Emma's legitimacy in question, her future standing in the community. Yes, he met her gaze steadily. Blackwell suggested we make things official, a proper ceremony to silence the gossip. The color rose in Hannah's cheeks. I see. She turned away, busying herself with settling Emma. And what did you say to that suggestion? That it was between you and me. Colton approached carefully, aware of the tension in her shoulders. Hannah, I won't force you into anything. When spring comes, if you want to move on, find a different life somewhere else, I'll help you do that. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Is that what you want? For us to leave when the path is clear? The question struck him with unexpected force. Was that what he wanted? The quiet solitude he'd cultivated for years, the empty cabin, the long winters with only his own thoughts for company. Or had something fundamental shifted within him these past weeks, something he'd been too afraid to acknowledge even to himself? No, he said finally, the truth emerging before he could reconsider. That's not what I want. Hope flickered in Hannah's eyes. What do you want, Colton? He took a step closer, close enough to see the flecks of darker blue in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lips. I want you to stay, both of you, not because of gossip or appearances, but because, he faltered, unused to articulating such feelings. Because the thought of this cabin without you in it feels wrong now, empty. Hannah's breath caught audibly. That's not exactly a declaration, she said softly. No, he agreed, finding courage in her steady gaze. The declaration is that I think I've been falling in love with you since Billings, Hannah Neal, even when I told myself it was impossible, that a man like me had no business dreaming of a woman like you. Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. I came here hoping only that you would acknowledge Emma, perhaps help us find our way. I never dared hope you might want more. I want everything, Colton admitted, the words flowing easier now. A real marriage, a family, a life built together, if you'll have me knowing all my flaws and fears. Hannah reached up, her free hand gently touching his cheek. I've known your heart since those days in the snowstorm, Colton James. It's why I never truly gave up hope of finding you again. Between them, Emma made a small sound of contentment, as if approving this turn of events. Colton smiled, encompassing both mother and child in his gaze. Then I think we should give Preacher Williams something to do before Christmas, he said, make honest folk of all of us. Hannah's laugh was bright and beautiful. Yes, she agreed simply. I believe we should. The ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the small church in Pine Creek, with half the town in attendance despite the winter weather. Martha Peterson had taken Hannah under her wing, helping her prepare a suitable dress from fabric ordered specially from Helena. Colton, for his part, submitted to a proper haircut and wore the suit he'd purchased after the war and never found occasion to use. Emma, dressed in a christening gown Hannah had sewn from the flannel Colton bought, was the center of attention, passed carefully from Martha to Josiah Peterson, who stood as Colton's witness. The baby seemed to understand the significance of the day, remaining unusually serene throughout the proceedings. When Preacher Williams pronounced them man and wife, Colton felt a weight lift from his shoulders he hadn't realized he'd been carrying, the burden of solitude, of believing himself unworthy or incapable of the very joy now before him. The townsfolk welcomed them with surprising warmth, the story of their Billings courtship and subsequent separation due to Hannah's aunt's illness now accepted as romantic rather than scandalous. Even Raymond Blackwell made an appearance, offering congratulations with political smoothness. Seems you took my advice after all, he commented privately to Colton. No, Colton corrected him, I followed my heart. There's a difference. By the time they returned to the cabin that evening, snowflakes were beginning to fall again, adding a crystalline beauty to the twilight landscape. Colton helped Hannah down from the wagon, then carefully lifted Emma from her basket. Welcome home, he said softly, both of you properly this time. Hannah smiled up at him, snowflakes catching in her golden hair like tiny stars. It already felt like home, she admitted. From the moment you let us stay. Inside, the cabin had been transformed by Hannah's touch over the weeks, curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, small touches of domesticity that had turned his bachelor dwelling into a family home. Colton placed Emma in her cradle, then turned to his wife in truth now, and drew her into his arms. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed, his voice rough with emotion. After the war, I didn't think I deserved it. Didn't think I could be what someone needed. Hannah leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his chest. Sometimes we find what we need in the most unexpected places, she murmured. I never planned to fall in love with a stranger during a blizzard. And I never planned on becoming a father, Colton added, glancing toward Emma's cradle. "But I can't imagine my life without either of you now." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silent white. Inside the cabin, warmth and light held the winter at bay, a family forged through chance, choice, and the courage to believe in second chances. 3 months later, as the first signs of spring began to emerge from beneath the melting snow, Colton sat at the table he'd built shortly after the wedding, watching Hannah as she moved about the cabin with Emma on her hip. The baby had grown remarkably over the winter months, now able to hold her head up steadily and reaching for everything within grasp. "Peterson rode by earlier," Colton mentioned, "says the pass should be clear within the week. First supply wagons from Helena are expected soon after." Hannah nodded, settling Emma on a blanket with her wooden toys. "Good, we're running low on sugar and I'd like to get some seedlings for a proper garden this year." "A garden?" Colton raised an eyebrow. "Planning to put down roots, are you?" She smiled at his teasing. "I believe that ship has sailed, Mr. James, or would you prefer I take a more temporary approach to our home?" "Home?" The word still filled him with wonder when spoken in her voice. Their home, built through a winter of shared work, quiet conversations by the fire, and the gradual weaving together of two separate lives into one. "Actually," Colton said, reaching into his pocket, "I've been thinking about making some improvements." He unfolded a rough sketch and placed it on the table. "The cabin served me well enough alone, but a family needs more room." Hannah came to stand beside him, studying the drawing. "An addition." "2 rooms," he confirmed. "One for Emma as she grows and one for," he hesitated, then forged ahead, "for any brothers or sisters that might come along." Her eyes widened, a blush coloring her cheeks. "You want more children." "I want everything with you, Hannah," he said simply. "A house filled with children if you're willing, a legacy to build together." Her answer was in her kiss, in the way she pressed herself against him with an enthusiasm that still surprised and delighted him after months of marriage. When they finally parted, both breathless, she rested her forehead against his. "I found something yesterday," she said softly, "while airing out your old trunk." Colton tensed slightly. The trunk contained the few possessions he'd carried from the war, his discharge papers, his father's pocket watch, and the letters from his mother he'd never been able to bring himself to reread. "What did you find?" he asked. Hannah moved to the shelf and retrieved a folded paper, handling it with reverence. "This was tucked between the pages of your Bible." Colton recognized it immediately, the letter she'd written him the day she'd arrived, explaining about Emma, signed with his name. He'd kept it, though he couldn't have said exactly why, tucked away with his most precious possessions. "I didn't know you'd saved it," Hannah said, a question in her voice. "It changed everything," he replied simply. "The moment I read it, though I was too stubborn to admit it then. It was the first time in years someone had seen me as something more than just a war-scarred drifter. You saw me as a father, as someone who might care for something beyond himself." She came back to him, the letter still in her hand. "I was so afraid that day, waiting for you to read it. Afraid you'd send us away, or worse, that you'd offer help but no heart. Instead, you gave me back a piece of myself I thought was lost," Colton said, drawing her into his arms. "You and Emma both." From her place on the blanket, Emma let out a delighted squeal, holding up a wooden horse Colton had carved for her. Both parents turned to watch as she began a concentrated effort to bring the toy to her mouth. "I have another letter to write," Hannah said thoughtfully. "To my sister in Ohio. I promised I'd let her know what became of us." She glanced up at Colton with a mischievous smile. "What shall I tell her about the handsome cowboy who found my note?" Colton chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Tell her he was stubborn and afraid, but not completely blind to the blessing that had landed on his doorstep." Hannah leaned into his embrace, both of them watching their daughter's determined exploration of her world. "And tell her that sometimes," she added softly, "love finds us even when we think we're lost, especially then." Outside, the spring sun broke through the clouds, illuminating the valley where a solitary cabin stood, no longer a hermit's refuge but a home, where a cowboy, his wife, and their daughter had found in each other the family they each needed but never expected. Where love, against all odds of the wild frontier, had taken root and flourished.